Good evening. Good evening. There you go. There you go. I'd like to welcome you to the 2013 Harrod Lectures, which began in 2004. They were established in the memory of Professor Harrod, who died in 2003. Harrod was on the faculty for some 34 years as professor of social ethics and sociology of religion. He wrote widely, with several books devoted to ethics and to Native American religions and cultures. In an email sent to me by his widow, Anne Marie, who sends her regrets due to an emergency that prevents her from being here, she shared with me a post she received from noted ethicist James Gustafson. It reads in part, "More than any other student I had, Howard took to my sociology of religion interests and work and developed his distinctive perspective, interests, and work. He was always his own person, innovative, and thus never easily categorized according to the rubrics that were used in his generation." Indeed. And I can think of no better person to ask to deliver this lectureship than our 2013 lecturer, Professor Louis V. Baldwin, Professor of Religious Studies here at Vanderbilt University. Professor Baldwin is a native of Camden, Alabama. He participated in student demonstrations and other civil rights activities in the 1960s. He graduated from Talladega College, where he received a BA degree in history and received his MA in Black Church Studies and MDiv in theology from Colgate-Rochester Divinity School, Bexley Hall, Crozer Theological Seminaries in Rochester, New York. He received his PhD in American Christianity from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Go Wildcats. Baldwin is a noted scholar of the life and work of Martin Luther King Jr. And to my mind, Baldwin is the best King scholar we have, because rather than resorting to simplistic hagiography, his work gets into the deep interior life of King's thought to reveal a complex thinker who is able to put concepts into action and action into witness. Author of over 60 articles, his books focus on King's cultural legacies, how it shaped King, and how King shapes us. And there is a balm in Gilead, and also to make the wounded whole. King's prayer life, Thou, dear God, and Never to Leave Us Alone. King's ecclesiology, The Voice of Conscience, the Church in the Mind of Martin Luther King Jr. King's global legacy, In a Single Garment of Destiny, a global vision of justice and toward the beloved community, Martin Luther King Jr. and South Africa. And finally, King's relationship to Malcolm X in Between Cross and Crescent, Christian and Muslim perspectives on Malcolm and Martin. His other books have focused on African American Methodism. His Invisible Strands in African Methodism, A History of the African Union Methodist Protestant and Union American Methodist Episcopal Churches from 1805 to 1980, won the American Theological Library Association Award in 1983. His There Is a Balm in Gilead won the Midwest Book Achievement Award of the Midwest Independent Publishers Association. And it is my personal sorrow as now the Dean of the Vanderbilt Divinity School, that I begin my time here as Professor Baldwin anticipates his retirement at the end of the year. Thank you, sir, for the countless students you have taught and minds you have opened. Our loss will be your retirement's great gain. I suspect that you will continue to mine King's thought and will give us new and more expansive ways to understand how a dedicated life can and does make a difference in our world. And I suspect also a few fish will be caught. After the lecture, I invite all of you to join Dr. Baldwin in the reading room for a reception in his honor. You can go just out the back and around the corner. In Tillett Lounge, there is a Baldwin Legacy display honoring a lifetime of scholarship, friendship, and publishing. Special thanks to Charlotte Liu and the Library Special Collections, Juanita Murray and Donna Smith, and the Divinity Library, Yolanda Norton, a PhD student here in Hebrew Bible, Janet Walsh, Library Collections at Tennessee State University, and Amy Steele, Assistant Dean for Student Life at Vanderbilt Divinity School, for putting this together. This display will be open throughout the weekend. Also, we invite you to a conference honoring Dr. Baldwin entitled The Voice and the Conscience, The Voice of Conscience, Civil Rights, Post-Civil Rights, and the Future Freedom Struggle. It begins with a reception tomorrow night at the Bishop Joseph Johnson Black Cultural Center from 6 to 8 p.m. This is followed by an all-day conference on Saturday that will be held here at the Divinity School from 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. that is free and open to the public. Free and open to the public. Finally, from 7 to 11 p.m., there will be a celebration also in the Divinity School to end the conference and send Dr. Baldwin out with a shout. Tonight, Dr. Baldwin's topic for this year's Harrod Lecture is A Citizen of the World, the Global Martin Luther King Jr. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Baldwin to this pulpit lectern, and thanks for his years of service to Vanderbilt as scholar, teacher, and citizen.
All right. First of all, I want to thank Dean Towns for those kind and generous words of introduction. The late Vernon Johns, pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, had an interesting thing to say about introductions. He said, those who deserve it don't need it, and those who need it don't deserve it. I'd like to think that I deserve it, but don't need it. I'm delighted to be here this evening, and I am highly honored and privileged to serve as the 2013 Harrod Lecturer. Howard Harrod was my colleague and friend. He devoted 30 years of his life to this institution, the Vanderbilt Divinity School, and many of us remember his achievements and the high standards he set as a teacher and a scholar. And we are compelled to contemplate all that we lost when Howard Harrod was taken from us. I am sorry that a certain set of circumstances made it impossible for Anne Marie, Howard's widow, to be with us tonight. But I'm sure that she is thinking about this occasion, and of course she is in our thoughts and prayers as we meet here tonight. When I was asked to deliver this lecture, I thought it might be appropriate to focus on Martin Luther King Jr. Because when we look seriously at the life and work of Howard Harrod, his extensive work in environmental ethics and his activism, his devotion to the struggle and the faith tradition of Native American peoples, and his advocacy for new and more perceptive ways of understanding humans and their relationships with the animal and natural worlds. When we look seriously at the dimensions of Professor Harrod's life and work, we find echoes of the same values that aroused a certain passion and heroism in the soul of Dr. King. Professor Harrod, like Dr. King, sought in his own way to integrate faith and learning with ethical concerns and social outreach and activism. And I know firsthand that Howard Harrod had great admiration and respect for Dr. King. He was inspired by King's tireless efforts to move this nation forward toward the fulfillment of its purpose and its destiny. And so tonight, as we pay tribute to my friend, Dr. Harrod, I am also thinking about Dr. King. Needless to say, Dr. King has affected each of us indelibly and in profound ways, but we still have not analyzed and assessed fully the true meaning of Dr. King's rich life and his enduring legacy. The magnitude of King's life may never be completely measured. Remembering King has become an annual ritual in this country, but too many Americans are still unclear about who Dr. King was, about what we should expect of him as a cultural hero and icon, and about what he might think and expect of us in this age of globalization. The King scholar Luther D. Ivory has alluded to the multiple and competing images of King, which continue to generate mass confusion in the public square. I am convinced that there is a need in our times to rediscover and reclaim Martin Luther King Jr. Because, as Vincent Harding and so many others have pointed out, King has gotten lost in our annual national celebrations of his birthday. In the thinking of all too many in this nation, King was simply a curious, gentle, and harmless Southern Black Baptist preacher who localized nonviolence and redemptive love and suffering as the core of the Christian faith. Others sensationally portray King as an American Gandhi, who was driven by some misguided and incurable optimism in a period of renewed hope and cultural change. I do not quarrel with these depictions of Dr. King this evening, but I consider them grossly inadequate Dr. King was what Peter Parris calls a radical, audacious prophet who had a vision for the world, who challenged this nation around the need for a new engagement, a new era of engagement with the world, and who gave his life in the struggle for what King himself called a new humanity and a new world order. And so it is this global Martin Luther King Jr., the king who called himself a citizen of the world, that I am most concerned about here and now, as I attempt not only to retrieve something of the historical king, but also to reflect upon his meaningfulness and his relevance for the global community in our times. I believe that we get at the true spirit of Dr. King, the man, when we take seriously his global significance, and more specifically, his impact on the liberation struggles of the poor and the oppressed in this land and abroad. Now, there is some debate among scholars about the precise point at which King's vision transcended Southern particularism and the ideal of the American dream to assume special meaning and significance for the whole world. James Cone and Frederick Downing contend that Dr. King's vision and ethic became international in scope after he received the Nobel Peace Prize in December 1964. The point being that particular award, the Nobel Peace Prize, provided the kind of global platform King needed to advance his proclamations for world peace. The Nobel Peace Prize was important in driving King's sense of global stewardship. But I submit that Dr. King's vision had international implications as far back as the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955-56, and perhaps even earlier. And that vision became more enlightened and explicit and found its fullest expression and its fullest maturity in the period from early 1965 up to the time of King's death in April 1968. As far back as May 1956, as the fervor surrounding the Montgomery bus protests reached fever pitch, Dr. King wrote, and I quote him, "The people of the third world are now rising up." And at many points I feel that this movement in Montgomery is part of this overall movement in the world in which oppressed people are revolting against the imperialism and the colonialism that have too long existed, end quote. Clearly, in Dr. King's thinking at that time, the civil rights movement in America, and specifically in the American South, was crucially linked to global events. Indeed, it was part of a larger worldwide crusade against the institutions and structures of violence, injustice, and oppression. I think it's clear that Dr. King, in refusing to separate the civil rights movement from freedom struggles abroad, revealed the profundity of his theological and ethical insight into the nature of evil in his day. This sense of being a part of an unfolding drama, of being a part of a larger world struggle for justice, was reinforced in King's consciousness during his trips to Africa in 1957 and his trips to India and the Middle East in 1959. In April 1957, Dr. King attended the independence celebration in Ghana at the invitation of the new Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah. And on that occasion, King spoke of what he termed the close bond between the American Negro and the Negroes of the Gold Coast. And King insisted that Ghana represented, quote, a victorious sector in the worldwide movement of colonial peoples toward the dawn of freedom, end quote. The trips to India and the Middle East were equally important for Dr. King as he became increasingly convinced of the international potential of nonviolence. Animated by his early travels and experiences abroad in the late 1950s, King actually joined the American Committee on Africa, a New York-based organization of Christian pacifists who contributed financially and morally to the anti-apartheid cause in South Africa and who advocated nonviolent approaches in the assault on systems of oppression worldwide. This was in 1957. King's affiliation with the ACOA was actually the beginning of his involvement with organized efforts to promote social, political, and economic change outside of the United States. From that point, the late 1950s, King's rhetoric would intensify, and his life would become inscribed into the histories of freedom struggles throughout parts of the so-called Third World, and especially in Africa. Evidently, Dr. King was inspired by a sense of a larger calling and by a broad vision of social responsibility. Equality with whites will not solve the problems of either whites or Negroes in America, he wrote, if it means equality in a world haunted by racism, stricken by poverty, and doomed to extinction by war. Interestingly enough, Dr. King had come to see the world as a global village. By 1965, he was using the metaphor of the great world house and the worldwide neighborhood, which suggested a totally integrated human family, undeterred by human differences, and devoted to the ethical norms of love, justice, and community. Dr. King wrote, and I quote him, "We have inherited a large house, a great world house, in which we have to live together, black and white, Westerner and Easterner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu. A family unduly separated in ideals, culture, and interests, who, because we can never again live apart, must learn somehow to live with each other in peace," end quote. At other points in his writings, Dr. King framed this world vision in terms of what he called the interrelated structure of all life. In his last book, The Trumpet of Conscience, King declared, and I quote him, "We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality." Did you ever stop to think that you can't leave for your job in the morning without being dependent on most of the world? You get up in the morning and you go to the bathroom and reach over for the sponge, and that's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. You reach for a bar of soap, and that's given to you at the hands of a Frenchman. And then you go into the kitchen to drink your coffee for the morning, and that's poured into your cup by a South American. And maybe you want tea, that's poured into your cup by a Chinese. Or maybe you are desirous of having cocoa for breakfast, and that's poured into your cup by a West African. And then you reach over for your toast, and that's given to you at the hands of an English-speaking farmer, not to mention the baker. And before you finish eating breakfast in the morning, you have depended on more than half of the world. This is the way our universe is structured. This is its interrelated quality. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality, end quote. And King added yet another layer of analysis to this whole worldview when he reminded us that through our scientific and technological genius, the world has become one geographically, but now we are challenged to make it one in terms of brotherhood and sisterhood. And King knew that this could only be achieved ultimately through moral and spiritual genius. This vision of the world house, of the world as a single neighborhood, of a global beloved community, was the core component of Dr. King's thought, what Kenneth Smith and Ira Zepp called the organizing principle of all of King's thought and activity. But Dr. King was perhaps at his best in terms of analysis when highlighting what Walter Fluker calls the major internal and external barriers to world peace and community. Now, in terms of internal barriers, Dr. King focused on hatred, ignorance, fear, and greed. But King said more in his last two books, Where Do We Go From Here and The Trumpet of Conscience, about the major external barriers, meaning racism, poverty, and war. Those giant triplets, which in Dr. King's words prevented the human family from living harmoniously, creatively, and productively in the world house. Small wonder that King devoted so much of his time, energy, and resources to the struggle against racism, poverty, and war as global phenomena. Racism, King held, provided the key to understanding most of the international problems, most of the international complications of his generations. The very thought of white men building empires on the sweat and suffering of colored people disturbed King so much, and this compelled him to become a part of worldwide coalitions of conscience committed to eliminating organized and institutionalized racism on a world scale. In December 1957, King became a co-sponsor with Eleanor Roosevelt and Bishop James A. Pike of the Worldwide Declaration of Conscience Against South African Apartheid, a document signed by 123 heads of state, religious leaders, and academics from various countries. And in 1962, Dr. King became a co-sponsor with the South African leader Albert Lutuli of the Worldwide Appeal for Action Against Apartheid, which was in the nature of a follow-up to the earlier Declaration of Conscience. The collaborative efforts with other national and world leaders on the part of Dr. King in attacking racism reveals so much about the global Martin Luther King Jr. When it came to racism as a world problem, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, you name it. Dr. King challenged humanity around the critical need for a culture of openness and enlargement. He challenged us to get beyond the lingering, antiquated thinking about race, to deal constructively with the personal and institutionalized racism that continues to fragment the social and political landscape on a national and global scale. And we must never forget King's challenge to the white world, or his insistence that white people develop the spirit and the readjusting qualities needed to prevent a possible worldwide race war. We must be careful now when marketing Dr. King as an authoritative figure when it comes to addressing current world problems, but I believe that Dr. King is still relevant in some ways today when it comes to the continuing human struggle with the question of race, and especially at a time when scholars like Angela Weiss and Donaldo Maceda are writing about the globalization of racism in the form of ethnic cleansing, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and rabid anti-immigration fears. Dr. King, I believe, still has something to say to us about how we might become truly a post-racial society and a post-racial world. But the profundity of King's analysis of the human condition, or the human predicament, was such that he did not isolate racism from other world problems. King said again and again during those last 3 years of his life that world racism cannot be successfully eliminated without an equally powerful attack on poverty and economic injustice. Dr. King lamented the fact that 2/3 of the world in his time lived in grinding poverty, a problem that inevitably led to undernourishment, malnutrition, homelessness, the lack of health care, disease, and death. And so King once again envisioned the possibilities of worldwide coalitions of conscience, constructed on the model of his proposed Poor People's Campaign to address the economic inequities and injustice endured by what he called the least of these, my brethren and my sisters. King called for a radical redistribution of the world's economic and material resources to feed the unfed, to clothe the naked, to heal the sick. And Dr. King also addressed the need for a sort of Marshall Plan, a new kind of foreign aid program, a program provided out of a sense of moral obligation, not political expediency. A foreign aid program that would compel America and the wealthy nations in Western Europe, as he called them, to provide capital and technical assistance for poor and underdeveloped nations. I believe that the world could benefit today from some level of ethical and theological dialogue with King around the problems of poverty and economic injustice. In this age of a declining global economics, we can learn something from the global King about how individuals, social groups, and nations might cooperate to ensure that people everywhere have adequate material resources and the basic necessities of life. King made this point over and over again with searing precision. We also need to revisit what the global king said about war and human destruction. In this age of sectarian warfare, organized torture and terrorism, political assassinations, and religiously based violence, Dr. King called for an end to war and for a new and more consistent ethic and culture of life, a culture of peace that goes beyond conflict between individuals and groups to address conflict between nations. Let's replace the arms race, Dr. King said, with the peace race. In this violent and fragmented world, he often declared, moral indignation alone is not enough. Dr. King told the world in his last book, The Trumpet of Conscience, that surviving in the world house means moving beyond a mere intellectual analysis of nonviolence to a practical application of that method in every sphere of human conflict. And King urged the United Nations to fully employ its resources as the world's peacekeeping and peacemaking force. This is why King's name still figures prominently whenever there are serious discussions about the ethics of war and peace in a global context. One of the things not so well known about Dr. King is that he also said a lot about the threat that religious bigotry and intolerance pose to the world house. The global king absolutely rejected the kind of claims to absoluteness that made it virtually impossible for Christians in the Western world to respect, to affirm, and to engage in fruitful dialogue with representatives of the other great faith traditions of the world. For King, genuine interfaith dialogue and cooperation embodied the only hope for creating life-giving relationships with humans in the globalized world. King practically applied this belief by bringing Protestants, Catholics, and Jews together in his civil rights campaigns and in his prayer vigils, other civil rights activities, and also by collaborating with figures like the Muslim spokesman Muhammad Ali and the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh in promoting appeals and declarations against war in general and Vietnam specifically. King occasionally noted that the great world religions, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, that these religions collectively embodied rich resources and possibilities for sharing and learning, especially in the realm of ethical and high human values. And let me add that King's indebtedness to Mohammed K. Gandhi alone shows that he was quite open to what John Tatum O'Neill calls the hospitality of receiving when it came to his encounter with the other great religions of the world. And it is clear that Dr. King sought, though unsuccessfully, to make the Christian church a pivotal and positive presence in that encounter with other world religions. As Dr. King studied the vast landscape of humanity and advanced his obligations as a world figure over time, he became more and more convinced that his own people, the Negro people of America, as he called them, had a vanguard role to play in the enduring struggle to actualize a global beloved community. In September 1964, While traveling abroad, King reflected on the large number of people who had shown up to hear him speak during a recent tour in Europe, insisting that this confirmed his conviction that, quote, the Negro is now in a position to lead the world, end quote. King went on to say, and I quote him, as the Negro goes, so goes the world. We are the conscience of the Western world, end quote. He goes on to say also, it may be the Negro who will give the new spiritual dynamic to Western civilization that it so desperately needs to survive. I hope this is possible. The spiritual power that the Negro can radiate to the world comes from love, understanding, goodwill, and nonviolence. It may be even possible for the Negro, through adherence to nonviolence, so to challenge the nations of the world that they will seriously seek an alternative to war and destruction, end quote. The American Negro, King concluded, was forcing a re-examination of the true meaning of democracy. And he said that the Negro, by taking to the streets and there giving practical lessons of democracy's defaults and shortcomings, the Negro was becoming a model for the oppressed people everywhere. Here King was interpreting the civil rights movement and indeed his own leadership in that movement in terms of its significance for the entire world. But even as King set forth a kind of messianic role for his people in the struggle to humanize the world, and even as he highlighted the image of the new Negro heralding a new world order to replace the old order of colonialism, exploitation, and segregation, Dr. King at the same time realized that the American Negro had much to learn from other oppressed peoples in the world. He had come to see this in his own people's encounter with Gandhi and the Indian struggle for independence. The global King clearly felt that the Negro's encounter with other peoples across the globe, with their religions, cultures, and ways of living and thinking, afforded rich and unlimited possibilities for both learning and the exchange of ideals and values. This was only natural for one who understood the interplay of systems of oppression worldwide. But what King ultimately hoped for was a world in which all human beings, and especially peoples of color, share ideas and strategies for freedom with each other, thereby blazing new paths toward the realization of a higher global ideal. This is part of what King had in mind when he spoke of the need for a worldwide revolution of values. King understood that shaping what he called a new kind of humanity would involve the mingling of the highest human values from peoples from every part of the globe. Again, I contend that Martin Luther King Jr. is so decisively the kind of figure who transcended his own context, especially in terms of his meaning, his authority, and inspiration for generations that have come after him. This means, of course, that we must read Dr. King both in context and beyond context. It is academically difficult, in my judgment, to distinguish neatly between King as a civil and human rights activist in his own historical context and the King to whom so many appeal today for insight, authority, and inspiration. Appeals to Dr. King to justify positions held on issues of war and peace, race, economic justice, and other social evils have overlaid his holy crusade with a surplus of meaning that time will not erase or obliterate. The Dreamer is the title by which King is still known, admired and respected around the world. Ebony magazine has reported that King's birthday is celebrated and recognized in some 100 countries, an honor not given even to this nation's greatest presidents. Perhaps more than ever before, people worldwide appeal to King as the quintessential idealist, human rights advocate, and social change agent. Indeed, King's name is still associated with a globalized rights culture. And his contributions in so many different areas, religion, theology, philosophy, culture, ethics, politics, his contributions in so many areas are assuming increasingly global significance. Interestingly enough, we are seeing this even in the scholarship on Dr. King today, this new surge of interest in the global king, a trend sparked initially by my own book entitled Toward the Beloved Community, Martin Luther King Jr. and South Africa, published by Pilgrim Press back in 1995. The Korean King scholar Hak Jun Lee published an important book in 2011 entitled The Great World House, Martin Luther King Jr. and Global Ethics, a work in which he discusses King's cosmopolitanism and the different ways in which King's thought and practice contribute to our current discourse about global ethics. A few months ago, Beacon Press in Boston issued my own edited volume of Dr. King's speeches and writings entitled In a Single Garment of Destiny, A Global Vision of Justice. And this work, I'm proud to say, is the first collection that captures the global vision of Martin Luther King Jr. through the prism of his own words and activities. And more recently, Wolf and Stock Publishers in Oregon released an anthology entitled In an Inescapable Network of Mutuality, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Globalization of the Ethical Ideal, a work co-edited by myself and Dr. Paul R. DeCarr, Professor Emeritus in Ecumenical Studies at Memphis Theological School. And this book, In an Inescapable Network of Mutuality, with chapters from some 10 leading scholars, religious leaders, and activists from different parts of the world, I hope may have the potential to crystallize this important trend in the scholarship on the global king. This attention to the global king is, in my judgment, one of the more vital and exciting trends in King scholarship today. Dr. King has re-emerged as a force on the contemporary global scene, in part because of the appearance of the publications I just mentioned. As I move toward my conclusion, I want to say that perhaps our next task as King scholars, or those interested in the global king, is to think seriously about Dr. King in relation to globalization theory and practice today. The current ferment in the scholarship on the global king will inevitably, in my judgment, lead to this. As many of you know, the term globalization, as commonly used today, most often means economic globalization, or the integration of national economies into the international economy through trade and capital flows and the spread of technologies, foreign direct investment migration. But globalization theorists also talk about global justice, the advancement of democratic freedoms and human rights, and the transnational sharing and/or exchange of the kinds of ideals and values and material goods that serve the most cherished intellectual, cultural, economic, social, political, and religious interests of the entire human family. And it is at this point that one hears echoes of the kinds of concerns raised by Martin Luther King Jr. a half-century ago, especially in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? The world is now interconnected in ways that Dr. King could only have imagined in his time. And any discussion of Dr. King in relation to contemporary perspectives on globalization is fraught with risk. But I am convinced that associating Dr. King with globalization in an historic sense is not oxymoronic. In other words, it's not excessive to contend that King was a precursor to much of what is defined as globalization theory and praxis today. King clearly prefigured contemporary globalization theorists and activists in highlighting the need for a fresh core of globally shared values in the interest of human welfare, human survival, and human community. And in light of this, we are compelled to ask ourselves, how should we approach the question of global justice today? How should we address the many enduring threats to democratic freedoms and human rights worldwide? What is our responsibility in the face of the globalization of racism? How concerned should we be about poverty, economic injustice, and the poor? What should be our response to the redefinition of the role of women and other marginalized groups in this global age? How should we deal with the problem of war and human destruction? What should we do about the degradation and the destruction of the environment? What does globalization mean in terms of religion and its changing context? In the context of globalization, should we be critical, uncritical supporters of the status quo, the global status quo? Or should we be advocates for diversity and the celebration of human differences? These questions still haunt us today, more than 40 years after Dr. King's death. Unlike globalizationists today, who are mostly economists and other social scientists, King approached these kinds of questions as a theologian and ethicist, giving far more priority to moral and or ethical than to economic and political considerations. And Dr. King's ideals on the global human situation could possibly be used today in framing a critique of how globalization is managed, because there are so many real problems with globalization. First, it is driven by powerful international corporations that benefit enormously and disproportionately from the movement of capital, goods, and technology across national boundaries. Another problem, globalization is considered a real threat to traditional societies and their cultures and values. Thirdly, too many of the managers of globalization seem more concerned about controlling the expansion of world markets and preserving their own status as power elites than they are about altruistic love and the unselfish and legitimate exercise of power. And these problems are further complicated by the lack of a globally acceptable and functional criterion for determining what global justice really means and how it can best be administered across geographical and cultural boundaries. And we must also remember that globalization too often serves the interest of the so-called developed countries themselves. And so again, I am convinced that it is possible to draw on King in formulating a constructive critique of current trends in globalization. King's ideals and values, and especially his communitarian ethic or his vision of the world house, can be useful in reshaping globalization, in making it more ethical, equitable, humane, and productive, so that there is no longer a threat to the freedoms and the cultural identities and values of certain people, and that all peoples and countries can have an equal voice in the policies and practices that impact their lives daily. I want to say, as part of my closing remarks, that a serious reading of the global Martin Luther King Jr. suggests 3 levels on which we might construct the kind of ethical value system needed to bring into being this ideal world of what Dr. King called a global beloved community. These include, number 1, learning how to sustain diversity in positive and meaningful ways. Learning how to sustain diversity in positive and meaningful ways. Secondly, developing a determination to overcome an obsession with materialism and greed. And thirdly, nurturing a genuine adherence to the idea that the forces of spiritual might are much more powerful in the universe than the forces of military might. A few words on each of these are in order if we are to understand fully the global Martin Luther King Jr. Concerning point 1, Dr. King concluded that the growing pluralization of the world demanded a movement away from viewing diversity as a weakness toward legitimizing, affirming, and celebrating diversity as a source of strength or as a virtue. This, for Dr. King, was not simply a matter of what he called extinguishing the flame of intolerance, but of dispelling the myth of superior and inferior races, removing all racial and ethnic barriers to community, eliminating poverty and hunger, and creating an atmosphere for genuine intergroup and interpersonal living, mutual acceptance, and shared power. In practical terms, this means seeking new ways of human beings living together in a globalized world. In an ethical vein, this involves envisioning the beloved community as the regulating and the highest human ideal. And in a theological context, it is about affirming that God's love is universal and inclusive of all. On that second point about overcoming a preoccupation with materialism and greed, let me say that Dr. King lamented the extent to which peoples throughout the world in his time were caught in the grip of materialism and greed. He spoke of a practical materialism, which means living as if there is nothing else that has reality but fame and material objects. Dr. King denounced what he termed the false gods of science, the false gods of money and pleasure. And he insisted again and again that humans cannot live by bread alone. The more we feed our material hunger, Dr. King declared, the closer we come to spiritual famine. From a biblical standpoint, the actions of the Good Samaritan on the Jericho Road were, in King's estimation, a model for how individuals, groups, and nations might overcome the lure of materialism while taking on a genuine and constructive ethic of giving and sharing. And now that third and final point about constructing, based on our reading of King, the kind of spiritual and ethical value system essential for the ideal world. When it came to the question of the supremacy of the forces of spiritual might over the forces of military might, Dr. King could not have been more insightful, especially in his own time. King detected that there were many forces, such as politics and religion, reshaping the world. But he wanted to live in a world in which spiritual values were held in higher esteem than the military complex. King believed that war, like racism and the neglect of the poor and marginalized, constituted ultimately a spiritual problem that required spiritual leadership and a conscious and persistent movement toward what he called spiritual ends, especially if humans are to live in what he termed a warless world. Humankind must turn, Dr. King said, to the weapons of the Spirit as the avenue toward a new and more noble global ideal. Let me close this evening with the global king's own words, uttered shortly before his death. They are words that still echo with startling clarity and a piercing urgency, words that could serve as our motto and our global call to action in 2013. Dr. King said, and I quote him, "Let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the children of God, and our brothers and sisters wait eagerly for our responses. Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell them the struggle is too hard? Will our message be that the forces of life militate against their arrival as full persons and we send our deepest regrets? Or will there be another message of longing, of solidarity with their yearnings, of commitment to their cause, whatever the cost? The choice is ours. And though we might prefer otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of history. Thank you.
We have time for about 5 minutes or so of questions. I ask you that they be questions.
Thank you, Dr. Baldwin.
Thank you.
One of your last points about the cultivating tolerance for diversity and cross-cultural ethnic groups. I'm thinking about genital mutilation and other issues like
Could you
that.
speak a little louder?
I'm thinking about genital mutilation and genital cutting, and how would King think about a tolerance for certain kinds of cultural practices or ethnic practices that strike so much against the core of a kind of peace or care, and that. So how would he deal with those kinds of issues?
Yeah, I think you know. Yeah, you're talking about, especially with respect to certain cultures in Africa, for an example. Obviously, given Dr. King's concept of the dignity and worth of all human personality, as you well know, that he got from the philosophy and theology of personalism, we know that he would very much oppose that kind of mutilation, that it would be be repulsive for him. So as one who preached that kind of idea of the dignity and worth of human personality, I think he would obviously be vehemently opposed to that, and much of his proclamations would be against that.
Other questions?
Thank you, Dr. Baldwin. Could you just speak a little to your relationship with the King family, if there is any, and if your future projects on Martin Luther King or other aspects of the modern civil rights movement?
Thank you. That's a great question. Well, I've met members of the King family and have talked with them and have gotten their support and blessings for the kind of scholarship that I'm doing, but nothing beyond that. I wouldn't describe that relationship as a very close relationship, but they have expressed support for the kind of scholarship that I'm doing.
Thanks be to God, Dr. Baldwin, for your wisdom and your integrity. But as people of faith, how do we collectively do what we need to do to make what you're saying happen?
That's a great question. Well, I'm not very good with how-to questions, but I do think that we have to look seriously at what leaders like Dr. King, Mohandas K. Gandhi, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, Dalai Lama, who is currently the leader of the Tibetan people, they have so much to say to us about how we might struggle for a world free of racism, a world free of poverty and economic injustice, a world free of violence and human destruction. So I think we have to decide in this 21st century how we can practically apply the ideas that these kinds of figures put forth. I think they're still relevant in so many ways. That's up to us. And I don't have all the answers, but I think that's a great question. Yes. But in the 1960s, one of the things that students did, of course, they had to come up with creative ways, and I happened to be alive at that time in high school and college, of protesting the system of segregation in the South. There were demonstrations, and I praise God that I was in some of those demonstrations. There were sit-ins, there were swear-ins, we called them, and kneel-ins. And we didn't always know what we were doing, but we just did something. And I think young people today have to come up with creative ways of addressing the kinds of issues that they face in the world today. I don't have the answers, but I think you have to come up with those kinds of responses to social evil. Social evil still exists in our society, in our culture, in the world. There is still racism, there's still poverty and economic injustice. There's still a lot of war and violence and human destruction. I don't have all the answers, but I think people have to look to figures like Gandhi and King, but you also have to come up with your own creative ways of responding to these kinds of problems. right? That might not be a very good answer, but as I said, I'm not very good at how-to questions, at answering, you know.
Thank you, Dr. Baldwin.
Yeah.
And I thank you all for coming tonight and encourage you to join us in the reading room for refreshments. And if you would give him just a little bit of time so he could get something to drink, further conversation with Dr. Baldwin. Again, don't forget the conference that begins tomorrow night with a celebration, reception, and then kicks off Saturday morning at 9 a.m. here in the reading room. An all-day free, let me say that again, free conference for those who would like to come. Thank you all and have a good and safe evening.